Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of the Data Protection Show with Janine West. I'm Craig Stewart, the founder and director of Dalebrook Media. And joining Janine and I this morning, Siobhan Omani, the co-CEO and founder of Marco Polo Advisory. Janine's joined them as well since the last episode, which is fantastic. So the team is on the recording today for this episode. Janine, Siobhan, how are you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks, Craig. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, good. Good to see you both. All right, so I think today what we want to do, maybe it will actually be good before we kick off into the topic that we're going to go through today on third-party data risk. Janine, Siobhan, maybe just give a little bit of an introduction into yourselves, into Marco Polo Advisory. And I think, you know, in terms of especially the data privacy and protection capabilities that you can bring to the market. So Janine, maybe we'll kick off with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Craig. And thanks for hosting us again. Firstly, I think it's very important if we look globally, we see all the data protection legislation that's coming in from an international perspective. I think the big one kicked off with GDPR in May 2018, and sort of everybody has been following suit. Not just, I think it's important from a regulatory point of view, but also reputationally, if you want to sort of be known as someone who can manage personal information and data from a safety perspective and make sure that it's protected, you need to make sure that you are adhering to the various laws that are out there, especially where they have extraterritorial scope, like the GDPR. So, for example, the GDPR protects the processing of EU citizens' data. Wherever you are, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, if you're processing EU citizens' data for certain purposes, then you've got to make sure you adhere to the GDPR.
Mm-hmm. And Siobhan, a bit of an introduction to yourself and Marco Polo.
Sure, thanks, Craig. I'll start off with Marco Polo. So we founded the business really middle of last year. In a nutshell, we are a data analytics consulting and services business, and really our aim is to assist organizations with everything from putting in place a data strategy to building out an analytics capability. If they already have an established analytics or data capability, to just assist them to sort of scale that, perhaps where they're not finding traction. And then really importantly, we wrap that in strategy. I think we always say your data and analytics strategy needs to be aligned to business strategy, so we're also able to assist with that. And then on the data governance side, which is where Janine comes in, really with a keen focus on data management principles, but also data privacy and protection. And I think Janine's already spoken a little bit to the importance of that. In terms of my background, I myself ran an analytics team once upon a time, not too long ago. I was the head of analytics at Investec for around 9 years. I built that function really from inception, which I guess what you find it is today. And I suppose we're really within the business are replicating some of what we did in the team and some of the successes we had there. So everything from your descriptive diagnostic analytics through to the more advanced predictive prescriptive analytics, financial modeling, market research, any of that kind of stuff is what we're looking to assist organizations with.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that. All right, so let's talk a little bit then around third-party risk. I know this is something that's coming up massively at the moment, and Janine, you'll actually be speaking at our Security Leaders Exchange event next week on it. But what are one of the biggest risks businesses face in terms of data protection and the processing of personal information at the moment, in your view?
So I think at the moment, one of the biggest risks is the sort of businesses have now gone and made sure that from their own, they've gone into their own housekeeping and looked at their own processes and made sure that they're doing it from a security perspective, and very often haven't followed it through to a third party or a fourth or fifth party. So haven't followed the whole life cycle of the personal information, the data that's being transferred. So what that means is that when you need to make sure that that data is protected right from the beginning of the processing right the way through. So whether you're receiving it, whether you yourself are a third party or whether you're passing it on to a third party, it's to make sure that you've got all the security practices in place to protect it throughout that life cycle.
And just like, I guess on that, it's around, how deep can you dive into your partners' data protection frameworks, policies, etc. I mean, you'll have multiple, as a really large company, like a large bank or a large medical aid or something like that. There's so many suppliers, there's so many partnerships, etc. How do you kind of allow that sort of deep dive or sort of open up the bonnet, if you will, and say, these are our frameworks, these are our policies in place? How do you kind of suggest people go about that, forming that sort of relationship?
I think it's important that, so there'll be sort of a once-off remediation perspective. So people have looked at things and historically kept all personal information forever. There have been certain controls in place, but definitely not to the depth we see that we need to be now. So it's about doing that enhanced due diligence, making sure that you have done the right checks with your third party and that you contractually bind them. The best way I think to approach is to look at a risk-based approach. So to rate them if you're looking at personal information that is transferred, looking at what is high risk, so what contains a lot of personal information and what could it be used for. Because obviously the big thing most personal information breaches are used is the information's used for identity theft. So if you look at the combination of data that you are transferring and making sure that you risk rate your third parties accordingly, and then obviously focus on the high risk ones very urgently and perform due diligence more often than you would on your medium and low risk. But not to forget those medium and low risks. And as I said earlier, also making sure that when it transfers to a third party and where it gets transferred to from there, that it's protected along that whole value chain.
Okay, yeah. And Siobhan, I mean, there's a lot of, Siobhan, go ahead and I'll ask you.
Great, sorry. I mean, I was just going to add to what Janine was saying, and I think, in our experience, we find with a lot of the clients that we're assisting, I think a really great starting point is also just to have a very robust and well-documented record of your processing activities, because I think that's always the starting point for you to really understand how data is being used, consumed, transferred, etc. in your organization. And I think very often what we find is that organizations start to come across third parties they weren't aware of. They were onboarded many years ago, there was no documentation around it or very minimal documentation, and people just forgot about it. So I think that vendor management piece that Janine has spoken to is critical, but I think a good starting point is always that records of processing activity, because if that is done properly, if it's done robustly, it will really give you the insight into all of those data flows and identify those third parties. And then, I think to your point, it's not necessarily about being able to assess every single third party to the nth degree. And I think there's some you just can't. When you're dealing with your much bigger organizations, your Amazons and so forth, there's no way you're going to be able to contact somebody and say, well, look, hi, I'm so-and-so in South Africa, and I'd like to run some sort of due diligence on you. I think there the expectation and the assumption is, and generally we find it to be the case, that they have got all the appropriate protocols in place. But I mean, an interesting stat to just share with everybody is I was reading a couple of days ago in an article that there was a SecureLink survey conducted in the US, and that 51% of breaches of the participants in that survey were as a result of third-party breaches. So it really is, I think, a significant risk and something organizations need to pay a lot of attention to. And also because the liability ultimately rests with the sort of original organization as such, so. Yeah.
Just talking about that sort of framework and having a documented and records, etc. What is the sort of, I guess, the timestamp or the expiry date on something like that? If you're working constantly with a partner, how often should you be checking their data management, data protection practices, their security, etc.? Is it sort of saying, okay, well, maybe we'll do due diligence every 6 months, or is it something that you go, well, they got it right the first time, then we'll just continue? Should people go back and check? Is it sort of just duplicating work? What's your sort of advice around that?
I think you need to look at the risk again. So looking at what type of information is sent across, and then also looking at when you did your initial due diligence, what was the finding? Did you find gaping holes? What was their security posture? Were they happy to embrace security and understand that it's part of their culture as a business? Or were there issues where you felt they weren't taking it seriously enough? In that case, I mean, if you have got genuine concerns, then you've got to actually ask yourself, should you actually even be doing business with them or looking for another provider? Or else, as I said, just making sure you do it on a risk-based approach according to what your risk appetite is. So it could be, I mean, it could be, you could, for example, do it your high risk on a 1-year basis and medium and low sort of 2 to 3 years. That's depending on the size of your organization again.
Okay, because I think that leads into my next question around, and Siobhan, maybe this is one for you, around the analytics side, actually using the data. You go through this whole process, you assess the risk, you look at the the frameworks, how you're going to use the data, all that sort of thing. You put in all the checks and balances. Now, how far down the line can you actually then start using the data? Because we talked about it at the conference a couple of weeks ago. Is this sort of not real time, but kind of increasing the speed to insights? Is this just slowing it down? So how can you actually do it correctly, but use the data in good time as well? Siobhan?
Yeah, look, I mean, Craig, I think it's a balance, and I think our sort of advice is also around being pragmatic, being commercial around it. I mean, the reality is that this is now legislated. It is required. So is it going to slow down real-time analytics, potentially initially while you're doing the work to become compliant? I mean, that is the reality. I think it also depends on the nature of the organization. So again, it's a typical answer of it depends, and it's great. I think if you are dealing with organizations who previously have been regulated for other purposes, I mean, there's other data legislation in place that has dictated sort of best practice around, protecting data and so forth. POPI, for example, or GDPR are not the first instances of it. So those sorts of organizations already, by their very nature, by the type of data they're dealing with, will have had procedures, protocols, etc. in place that meant they were already probably doing a significant portion of what they needed to do. The data privacy requirements now sort of take that a step further. So I think in those instances, there the delay is potentially less so. But certainly, I mean, also when legislation comes in, you're given a certain time to comply. So it's never a case of you have to stop what you're doing today, become compliant, and then you can restart. So I think it is a case of demonstrating you're on a journey to organizations like the regulator and continuing to do what you do. But some of the mechanisms you can put in place are also very quick. We're not necessarily saying stop everything you do to go and source some sort of fancy technology or system to help you. Simple things around being more careful around how you're transferring data amongst yourself in an organization. Get in place just proper SLAs if it's between different divisions who may be different entities. That kind of stuff can be spun up very, very, very quickly. Ensure the appropriate procedures around passwords and password controls are in place. Appropriate procedures around minimizing the data you share, anonymizing the data share. Those are best practices that I think as analytics and data practitioners, we should have been adopting anyway as part of our way of doing things. So in my experience, and as I say, having headed up an analytics team, no, it didn't delay us, it didn't prohibit what we were doing, because for the most part, we were doing those sorts of things anyway in the normal course to treat the data ethically, to treat the data appropriately. It's potentially just enhanced some of what we've needed to do, particularly in the case where it might have been a cross-border transfer or across entities, that sort of thing. So I certainly don't think that it should or needs to delay the process, because I think you can take a pragmatic approach, start small and build up and continue to do things in parallel.
Yeah. And what are both of your thoughts on sort of a data sharing platform like Omniscient? I'm not sure if you were there for their presentation or the panel discussion, Siobhan, at the Data Leaders Exchange, but sort of a data sharing platform. And they've designed that with privacy first design principles. Janine, what are your sort of thoughts around that, where there's, sort of, I guess, an aggregator or a place, a platform where people can actually put their data in there, it's all secure, etc. Is that a good way to go? Does that solve a lot of these issues, or does that potentially open up a lot more problems as well? Does that, we need to make sure that everybody's been checked before they get in there, which is what Omniscient does. I'm not sort of definitely not discrediting the platform at all. It's excellent. But do you think that's a good way? Does that kind of solve a lot of these sorts of problems, or do the checks and balances still really need to be in place?
So I think it's an answer of sort of both, without trying to also just make it sound very grey. I think it's a very good platform, and if it's secure, similar to Omniscient, you can trust it, and that the data is treated ethically, as Siobhan said. But also there's other worries that you'd have to have. You'd have to have concerns around the fact, looking at what are they using all the data for? Are they actually does anybody else have access to it? Because the monetization of data, as you know, is also a big thing. And I think aside from the Omniscient one, because I know that's not their model, it's looking at what would be what would they be using? Would they be keeping any of that data? Siobhan and I have actually seen quite a few third parties where they sort of provide these platforms or offer a service, and it's actually to gain access to data that they can then use for their own purposes or further on sell. But having a secure environment like that in place, I think, is a very good idea. Having had all the checks and balances, making sure that it does meet the standards. both from depending on which personal information you're processing, if it's EU citizens as well, making sure it meets the GDPR requirements. Or else if it's a separate one, it's definitely showing that you've done the due diligence. I think the one thing that we have seen is that the regulators aren't going to take lightly to you saying, okay, well, we passed this data on, so it wasn't our fault that there was a data breach. We need to take accountability right the way through.
Yeah.
And Craig, I think if I can maybe just sort of make 2 comments in that regard. I caught the end of the Omnisium presentation, but admittedly, I am not too familiar with the platform and the detail of it. I mean, one thing I would always just, and so I don't comment on Omnisium here, but in general around data aggregation platforms, is I would probably just be concerned around concentration risk. You know, if it does become the sort of go-to aggregation platform for this sort of thing, in my mind, they automatically then become a target. And I think there are some good examples out there recently, even in South Africa, where similar sorts of aggregation providers have been targeted, perhaps not for exactly the purpose Omniscient is doing it, but where there are large organizations aggregating significant amounts of data, you automatically become a target. The other thing I just wanted to raise is that whenever we talk data privacy, data protection with clients and so forth, people automatically default to sort of electronic means of data. Yeah. And a significant portion of data and information that is held by organizations is not in electronic format. And I think it's really important for people to not forget about that, because these sorts of aggregation platforms then don't necessarily always solve and address those risks and the issues pertinent to those, which is also sometimes where your biggest risk lies. I mean, we've got horror stories of the sorts of information organizations could be storing on Post-it notes and those sorts of things, or in notebooks, you know, when people are just taking notes in meeting. And so it's really about those sorts of practices. And I think Janine mentioned it briefly earlier, but about data privacy and protection becoming embedded in your culture. You know, simple things, like when you're having a meeting in an organization and you could have had hard copy handouts and potentially there's some sensitive information in that. Very often those will just be left lying around in the meeting room. Those need to be collected after the meeting, shredded and destroyed. It's just all of those sorts of considerations that unfortunately there aren't platforms yet that can address all of that. And I think it's just important that people are aware of the non-electronic data and information too.
Yeah. That's such a vital point, Siobhan. Thanks for bringing that up, because I think you're right. No one thinks about that. It's everything, you know, we're transferring it, you know, digitally to everyone, but you know, how often do people go out and work at a coffee shop these days and perhaps leave their notebook, your actual physical notebook, not the laptop, you know, version. They just leave it there by mistake, and there's so much information. Okay, well, I'm just going to go off to the bathroom and I'll leave my laptop. You're kind of out of the bounds of your office. Yeah, it'll be fine.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it really affects every sort of touch point in your operational processes that you really got to think of. I mean, one of the challenges we had as a team initially was we would do a lot of work on airplanes while we were sort of traveling between our regions within South Africa. And, you know, processing is defined as just reading something on a screen. So we automatically had to get sort of screen protectors and that sort of thing, so that where we were in those situations, somebody sitting behind us looking over our shoulder couldn't see what we were looking at and what we were working on. It's all of those sorts of considerations that you've got to be on top of. And that's where I say, you know, for us as a team, it became about those sorts of small things, because the other sort of best practice things we were already doing. But it's that kind of stuff you've really got to have your finger on the pulse of.
Yeah.
Janine? Definitely. And I think Craig, I was just going to say what's also an important aspect of that, I think, is also looking at it from a privacy by design perspective. So bringing privacy in sort of there's, as I said earlier, there's a remediation piece where you've got to go back and look at your third parties and look at the data that you share with them and how it's transferred. But there's also the piece where you've got to look at it as you start to do new projects. So as you take on a new third party, or you take on a new system, and it's about bringing it in right at that design phase, so that it's not an afterthought, so that you can sort of look at the boxes, do the testing, and make sure that the posture is correct, and you're willing to deal with that right up front. You don't go and do it afterwards when there's been an incident, or when, you know, you think, okay, maybe now it's time for us to check.
Yeah. All right, cool. All right, so I think let's close off with final points. And it was in the sort of the key points that you both wanted to talk about was the enforcement committee, which sounds like something that might be coming out of an Avengers film. Talk to us a little bit about the enforcement committee, Janine, and sort of what we're going to be seeing with that. What are kind of the trends that you see internationally with something similar to that, and what people should be looking out for?
Well, so I think it's very important that the information regulator is in the process of finalizing the appointments of the enforcement committee, appointing the chairperson. So I know they have advertised for the roles and have been filling those. I think when the enforcement committee comes into effect, we're going to be seeing then actually the enforcement piece of the regulator arm being carried out. Internationally, we see, people sort of look at a fine and they say, okay, well, for example, with Papier, it can be 10 million rand, or the 10 years in jail, up to 10 years in jail. But what we don't look at is the actual civil claims that can come from it, or that it could be per instance. So we don't know how that will be levied out. If you look internationally, what we did see with the GDPR when that came into effect, and those three sort of big breaches that happened in 2020, the regulators, the Information Commissioner's Office there actually went after the third parties as well as the actual institutions. The third parties did try sort of blame it on an issue with their, the businesses did blame it on an issue with their third parties. The regulator didn't take that into account. They said you should have done your due diligence and made sure that you were dealing with people or industries, businesses that had the right security in place. Siobhan, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, not really, Jean. I think my sort of overarching principle that I leave clients with is just to remember that data privacy legislation is consumer protection legislation, that in many countries it is a constitutional right that individuals have to data privacy and protection. And I think as more and more breaches continue to happen, which I think we can expect, and many of these breaches we're seeing also happen many years ago, before some of the privacy legislation was out there, but sort of cyber criminals and stuff have been sitting on the data. So I do think we'll continue to see more of it. But as we continue to see that, I think the awareness amongst consumers will continue to grow around the use and the abuse, the misuse of their data. And I think you can just then, as a result, expect to see more of these sorts of civil claims also. So that's all I would add, is just remember it is consumer protection legislation. It is a constitutional right in many cases. So I think you can expect to see many consumers, as they become more aware, also taking action and so forth against organizations.
And one of the themes, just maybe to further close off, but this kind of popped in my head. The theme that we had at the data leaders event that we had a couple of weeks ago was better practice, not best practice, because once these things are never entirely solved. We're never going to get to a point where there's no data breaches, someone doesn't leave a hard copy of something lying around. Do you kind of see from your experience, you're working with clients and various things, that there is becoming a change because it is so prevalent at the moment, and the culture and the awareness within organizations is just kind of at that high level? Are you seeing sort of a reduction of mistakes, breaches, etc.? Is that sort of funnel getting narrower, or do we still have a really long way to go until the risks kind of lessen to a degree? I know they're never going to go away. I don't know who wants to tackle that.
I'll start, if that's okay, Siobhan. I think what we're seeing is that there's no room for arrogance in this space. So we've seen a lot of businesses that we deal with, they actually, in the past might have said, okay, we actually can handle this quite well, and we've got all these security practices in place. But it's now looking and thinking, the regulators said it quite a few times, information regulator at a couple of the talks that I've been to, it's not if, it's when. So it's looking at it and saying, well, if it were to happen to us, what could it be, and how do we protect the most valuable information that we hold, and how do we make sure that we are looking after that adequately? Siobhan, I don't know if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Craig, in my view, it's yes and no. I think again, for some of the organizations who are used to being regulated, who are used to sort of running big compliance teams, who are used to sort of that sort of risk-based approach and that risk mindset up front, I think yes, I think you do see improvements and then getting better and better. You're never, as you say, going to be fully compliant as such. I mean, it's human behavior. Somebody will make a mistake unintentionally, and you've just got to have the right processes and procedures in place to deal with that when it happens. But I think really it is the breadth of the legislation that is different here, that it does essentially almost affect, every consumer, every business, barring the few exceptions there are. And I think it's those organizations who are not used to having been regulated, who are in industries where this isn't the norm, that are still really trying to grapple with and get to sort of terms with what it means to comply. It isn't a once-off exercise. It's not about having a policy on your website and a breach notice or something like that. It's ongoing. You've got to embed it in your processes. And I think that's where in my consultations I've seen sort of the most struggle, really. But I think what's important is that people are putting in the effort. They definitely are trying. But I think Janine is right. There is no place for arrogance. And I think that where that exists, or where data is being inappropriately used, you will be very quickly exposed, ultimately.
Perfect. All right, Janine, Siobhan, thank you so much. Fascinating episode. I look forward to the next one. I just think, in closing, I think to everyone is just be constantly aware. That seems to be the message. It's just never going to go away. It's never going to be perfect. But I think, weave that conversation. It's the words, right? So it's constantly having that conversation, repeating it, every conversation, like end of every meeting, make sure you take your stuff. As nauseating as that can probably become over time, I think it's just the way you need to do that. I think it's like having kids, constantly just telling them to do the same thing over and over and over. But stay the course, get it done, make sure that you're protected as much as possible. So Janine, Siobhan, thanks so much for joining. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.